And great. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the second in a series of special topic trainings on mass casualty incidents, specifically targeting the disaster mental health community across New York State. We have joining us folks who are members of teams situated through the Office of Mental Health in New York State, as well as members from teams and other interested parties from localities, counties, et cetera, who also have teams ready to go or are in the process of building teams. So we are grateful that all of you have taken some time to join us. I do want to mention first, before we get going, that there is a recording for part one of this series that we delivered last month. And Mike is going to be putting that into the chat for you if you would like it. You're more than welcome to read these in any order that you want to. And oh, Carla, I just muted you by mistake. Sorry.
I'm muted now. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're back. Okay, good. Yeah, and so that'll bring me to another point here is that if you wouldn't mind muting yourselves, I may mute you if I do hear background noises that might be distracting for folks, but that does not mean that we don't want you to participate in this. For the time being, let's limit questions to the chat. Mike Bigley will be watching the chat, and he'll let us know if there's a question that is that needs to be raised in the moment. Otherwise, we may hold some of those till the end as well. So just be prepared for that. And he'll break in and interrupt Carla to ask those questions as needed along the way. So put questions into the chat if you don't mind. We are being recorded. There is a recording now. I see that Mike put that into the chat now, so feel free to access that anytime you'd like to. The chat won't be up after today's training, so copy and paste that onto something that you can look at it later if you'd like to along the way. So with that, I want to again welcome you all and tell you that we are happy to introduce to you Dr. Carla Vermeulen, who will be leading our training today. Dr. Vermeulen is an associate professor of psychology at SUNY New Paltz, so right here in New York State, and we're very grateful to have her expertise and her knowledge and her background as a platform for this and other trainings that we're offering as well. Carla is also the former deputy director of the Institute for Disaster Mental Health, also situated at SUNY New Paltz. So we are really grateful to have you on board with us today, Carla. And we know you're a great friend of our program, and we can't wait to hear what you have to tell us today about disaster mental health and specifically mass casualty events. So I noted that we're not sharing anymore. Did you do that, Carla?
Not intentionally, but
okay.
Let me get back to that. Okay, we back?
There we go. Yeah, we are back.
All right, hitting all the wrong buttons today.
I'll hand it back over to you, Carla, and take it away and let me know if we can be supportive in any way along the way. Okay. Oops.
Okay. Oh, I did not hit anything that time, huh?
Okay. Well,
all right, we'll try this one more time,
and I'll do the share and I'll follow along with you.
Okay. Yeah, we have belt and suspenders policies for this, and if my electrical power goes out and all of the plans. Yeah. So that's what this team does. So all right. Thank you very much, Skip. Appreciate the warm welcome. And yeah, I've been working with Beeper and OMH for well over a decade, I think, at this point, doing this kind of training, development, and delivery. And so really, I'm not in the field myself. I'm more of an academic, but really appreciate the work that team does and that all of you who are in this audience do. And especially, I think this topic of mass casualties is so important and timely, and I don't need to convince any of you about that, I don't think. So this is what we're going to be talking about today. Oh, I do not know what's going on. Hang on.
I'll share mine, and you just tell me when to shift the the slides, okay?
Okay, sorry about this, people. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about in this part 2 of our MCI special topics trainings. So really what we're going to focus on today is the different settings where these responses are likely to take place. And as we'll see, there are a lot of them. They're often not totally clearly defined, the differences between them, but we'll kind of cover some of the main places that often do get stood up after MCIs. And then most of that's kind of the shorter term stuff in part 1. Then we'll look at some more ongoing settings, and we'll do just a couple slides on anniversary reactions for both survivors and responders in that kind of longer term out into the future. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So this was the focus of the original one that we did last month. And so as Skip said, we really encourage you to go back and watch that if you have not done that already, because while we're talking today about specifics about where this work occurs, that was much more focused on what this kind of response work looks like, what you might be exposed to if you get deployed to one of these events, and above all, how you can actually help survivors who are really going through a terrible, terrible experience. And then also taking care of yourself, because, and this will be another theme we'll talk about throughout today, doing this kind of work is high intensity and really can, have a toll in terms of those occupational hazards like vicarious traumatization, compassion fatigue, all of those things that we definitely want to make sure you have the tools to avoid falling prey to. Next, please.
Carla, it sounds like there's a delay when the slides are switching. I'm seeing them switch right away, but it sounds like you're waiting for them.
Yeah, so I'm still on part 2. Sorry for the inconvenience for this.
So I'm on slide 4 now. Are you seeing that?
The defining, yes, I am seeing that now.
Okay, good.
Okay, sorry, people. We'll get this. We'll get this organized. Okay, so this is basically a repeat slide from that original training, but we just wanted to include this either as a refresher for people who are at that, and then to have common language for those of you who are just joining. This is your first one. So basically, like so much in the disaster response field, there's no single definition of what makes something qualify as a mass casualty incident. And there's also technically a differentiation between mass casualty, meaning a lot of injuries, versus mass fatality, meaning a lot of people who have died in the event. And of course, something can be both of those. I think often people use the terms interchangeably or use mass casualty to refer to mass fatality as well, so don't be surprised by that. But I think what's tricky about this is there's really no set standard for what qualifies as mass in this response, because it's really kind of relative to the local response capacity. So an event that might be more of a terrible, still a disaster, but within the response capacity in a major city that has a lot of hospital capacity and highly trained emergency management capacity could easily be experienced as an MCI in a lower resourced area. So it's really kind of how much can the response field keep up with what those demands are. But across the board, even without any kind of definition, these are events that include sometimes property damage as well, depending on what it is, but absolutely human suffering, pain, injury, loss of life. And so between the victims who are experiencing those things themselves, and then a lot of the focus with these is on their survivors, their family members, their loved ones, it's a lot. And that's not to say that, losing your home in a hurricane is not a lot also, it is, but now you have that human loss on top of it. So these are just some of the characteristics you might get exposed to if you are involved in this, or just to, know are going to be part of the mix for people who are involved in these. And it's also important to remember that typically for every one victim of these events, you're going to have multiple family members, multiple loved ones showing up at all of these post-MCI settings. So you're looking typically at a surge of a lot of people who are in a lot of distress and anxiety and anger and guilt and all of those other powerful emotions. So absolutely, need to be prepared for that. And I think there's no question that mental health is a major component of the response to these kinds of events. And so very important that people are trained specifically in responding to these and available so that you can bring those skills and hopefully kind of at least reduce the suffering people are going through. But of course, you cannot take it away completely. And Skip, it looks like I am able to advance things. So I am back in charge now, it looks like. Okay, so our major setting for today is going to be just what are some of these response settings. So just a few general points before I start.
Carla, I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't think you're sharing.
Oh, okay.
I stopped my share and I don't think you're sharing. So
sorry, everybody.
Get mine going again.
Okay. If we could get up to the response settings slide 6, please.
Can you see that?
I think I am seeing it on my own computer rather than yours. So I'm just going to kind of follow along on mine, and I will assume you'll stop me if anything is going on.
Okay, let me just check in with someone watching. Can you see slide 6 right now?
Yes, it's on slide 6.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Amy.
Thanks. Okay. Okay, so basically in all of these, some sort of general points. So whatever kinds of settings are going to get stood up, and that is going to vary by the type of event, by the different combinations of organizations and agencies that are going to be involved in that. So I won't go through kind of every single possibility of that, but basically when these events happen, they need to be responded to very, very quickly at certain levels, and then with continuing support and care at other kinds of levels as the situation unfolds, becomes clearer, victims are identified, people are reunited with survivors, all of those kinds of things. So we'll talk about the main ones here, but once again, just keeping in mind, these are very intense emotional settings, and these are settings where you are almost guaranteed to be dealing with grief and loss and, as I said before, anger and guilt and all of these other really strong emotions. So, you definitely want to get that specific training in this so that you are prepared for handling that, because that can just be really overwhelming. Like even for very skilled mental health professionals, to be exposed to that intensity of emotions at that collective group level, that's a whole other ball game. So this is why we so value the fact that people are willing to get these trainings in disaster mental health for those with that background, in psychological first aid. But really these events, the needs are going to go beyond psychological first aid most typically. And part of what you're likely to encounter is just so much uncertainty around these. People just, for most people, this is the first time they've gone through something like this. So they don't know where to go. They don't know what to expect. They don't know when they'll get different kinds of information. So part of what you might be able to help with is just being that source of information, finding that out. And that's not stuff you are expected to know on your own. This is why you have a supervisor, up the chain of commands in ICS, whoever you are working with, you should be going to them for that information. But I also think really recognizing the people, doing whatever you can to advocate for getting information out as clearly as possible to those survivors so that they just know, taking away some of that uncertainty. And the other key point here is the basic premise is, OMH, mental health, county mental health people, whatever your particular role is, we're not first responders, right? We should not be there while the event is still going on, if there is still ongoing danger of any kind, but we want to get there as early as possible afterwards to ensure that mental health support is included in that early response and all of those needs that people are going to have. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this slide is a bit of our kind of cautionary tale without getting into too many specific examples, but the theory is that there are plans in place for whatever kind of foreseeable, predictable disasters might happen in a county, in a community, in a city, et cetera. But of course, it is not always possible to predict everything or have plans, for every eventuality. One of the basic themes across all these response settings I'm going to be talking about is ideally they are set up someplace near where the disaster occurred, but not on the scene, because the last thing you want is community members, family members getting exposed to that scene at a point when that is not appropriate or helpful for them. So, you don't want it to be too far so it's inconvenient, but you don't want it to be so close that people are actually getting traumatized through that direct exposure. And this, unfortunately, was kind of part of a lesson learned after the Lake George boat disaster, the Ethan Allen tourist boat that's capsized and sank in 2005 and had a horrible death toll of 21 people. Most of them were elderly tourists who had been visiting and just out for a nice, September boat ride kind of thing. And then this happened. And of course, this was not, I'm sure they had plans in place, but just the immediacy, the fact that a lot of the people who were involved in the response were not emergency managers, not professionals, but just other boaters who came and tried to help. A lot of people got some exposure directly that was not ideal for them. And I'm not saying it could have been avoided necessarily, but you can sort of read these passages from a New York Times article that came out shortly afterwards. So they had to set up a morgue on the lawn beside the lake. Took a while for them to remove the remains to an appropriate place. And so people were unfortunately seeing those covered up remains. And this one poor person believed he saw his wife and then was told, don't jump to conclusions, you don't know yet. To me, that's kind of one of those, probably not a helpful thing for someone to say, but how is the guy who owns the motel to know what was supposed to be said? So there again, that's why it's so important to have the professionals be in that kind of comforting and advising role so quickly. Another thing that happened here was, for whatever reasons, the Family Assistance Center, where people could go, where survivors could go to get information and resources, was set up at the same hotel, is my understanding, where many of these people had been staying. So you had this kind of overlap of roles, and you had just kind of regular hotel residents there. And apparently that was very difficult for a lot of people to experience, including the hotel staff. I think we don't always think about the impact on people. Sure, we can set up the reunification center, the assistance center in a hotel, but we're not necessarily, in the past, it has not necessarily been considered what effect that's going to have on those civilians who are getting exposed to these very high intensity settings as well. And another point that we were talking about in planning this training is this picture. I mean, this is a hard picture to see, and we really kind of considered whether it was appropriate for us to include it or not. But I think this is another factor, and I'll come back towards the end about the role of media. This was a picture that was in a local newspaper shortly after this event occurred. And here you have someone who is a first responder, but even for him, that's, you can see the devastation that he's experiencing. And, all you see is a foot, but that you were seeing remains. And is that okay for newspapers to cover, for people to be viewing, et cetera? So I don't have an answer for that, but just another of these factors that can complicate these kinds of events. Next slide, please. Okay, so getting into the few specific kinds of centers that we are going to talk about. So first is family reunification centers. And so these are basically what are set up immediately after something has happened, especially if there are missing people, people who have not been identified yet, whether they're injured, whether they have been killed. So I'll come back to a school example in a moment, but say there's an event at a school, you have, hopefully most of the children are there and are safe. Their families are going to come rushing to that center to try to get reconnected with them. And so the families who are coming into these places, these typically spring up kind of immediately afterwards. And these are people who have so much uncertainty and anxiety. They are waiting to find out if their loved one has been killed or seriously injured or has, had a life-changing experience. So next slide, please. Oh, and you can, for each of these, we sort of mentioned a few of the organizations that might be there. But of course, that's never going to be a totally comprehensive list. It's just going to vary based on the kind of event. Okay, are we on the reunification center map? I'll assume we're on slide 9.
We're there.
Okay, thank you. This is just one example of a little bit of a fuzzy image, sorry about that, but just an example of how one of these kinds of centers might and ideally should get set up physically. And the real takeaway here is that you want to have kind of separate areas for different contingencies of people. So you want to have an area. So again, this is a school incident, not necessarily a shooting, but just something that happens at a school. You want to have some kind of holding area for all of the children who are safe and not injured. You want to have some kind of check-in area. You can see here on the parking lot, kind of on the upper right, where the families who are arriving to hopefully get reunited with their children are presenting identification, filling out whatever paperwork is necessary. Then you want to have a separate area where those families are waiting and another area where those reunifications are occurring. You don't want all of that going on in one place because just, again, that kind of vicarious exposure, and whether that's positive or negative, again, their chances are strong. Some of those families are not going to be reunited with their missing loved one. You don't want them witnessing the happy reunions. You don't want the people who, with the positive outcome, being exposed to the suffering of those who are still waiting. So really kind of thinking through all of these issues around what are the steps involved and how can we try and have a physical space that can get set up very quickly that's going to attend to all of those different demands. Not easy, as you can imagine. And so if you, as a mental health person, were deployed to one of these, you could be in any one of these areas. You could be just trying to keep the kids entertained and calm while they're processing what they've been through and are waiting to get reconnected with their families. You could be in the family waiting area where there's that mix of uncertainty. And you could be present potentially at a death notification, if that is what is unfortunately going to be the outcome and that identification has been made. So that would absolutely ideally be done privately. There have certainly been cases where it hasn't, adding even more trauma for everybody, but the goal is to do that as respectfully as possible. Next slide, please. So these are just a handful of the things that you would want to consider if you were involved in either planning a family reunification center or responding at one. So, timing is going to vary tremendously. Sometimes it's going to happen very quickly afterwards. Sometimes there's going to be a delay. We certainly know in any kind of disaster where cell service goes down, or we just don't have contact information for people. If it's one thing if it's an airplane where there's a manifest and we know who is exactly on the plane. It's another thing if that was a commuter bus or train and we don't know who was on it. So even just knowing who needs to be notified can be tremendously tricky. Absolutely security concerns. Media should be kept out of these sites and pretty much out of all of the sites I'm going to be talking about. I'll return to that point in a bit. But, how do you make sure that the people who are coming in legitimately have a reason to be there? You don't want tourists, you don't want journalists sneaking in who shouldn't be there. So that is challenging for sure. Some MCIs, you're also going to have people who are displaced from homes. I mean, thinking about, wildfires, floods, all of those. So there again, how do you reconnect people? How do people even know kind of where they should be heading? Privacy issues, that ties into the security, but also so much growing use of DNA for identification, especially if remains cannot be visually identified. How else might that DNA be used? Are people going to be willing to give that sample, et cetera? And then just how do we train people, which is what we are doing here. So we certainly encourage you to get more intensive training if this is something you think you might be involved in. Okay, next slide, please. So as I said before, there are a number of different positions or jobs that mental health might be serving in these events. And of course, a huge shift in outcome is going to be if you are working with a family whose loved one is safely returned to them or not. And, I feel like I'm repeating myself at this point, but just recognizing for some people, the worst day of their life turns into maybe the best day of their life, but for others, it's staying the worst day of their life. So as we've already said, just expect that high levels of distress. And that can, we talk about this in the psychological first aid and disaster mental health trainings. When people are anxious and distressed, they often take it out on people unfairly. So I think for all of these settings, you just want to be prepared to be confronted with anger, which I would say is just fear coming through as anger or as fear or, all the other extreme emotions we might expect to see. And yes, possibly present during death notifications. Those would typically be handled by law enforcement, or I believe sometimes by someone from a coroner's office, that side of things. But certainly mental health may well be present at that, as well may be spiritual care. Often that's sort of done in teams, so you have different forms of support for people while they're getting that news. And the Red Cross is often very strong and very involved in the mental health response in these events. All right, so those are family reunification centers. I would say those are, likely to be probably among the most intense because of that uncertainty and can't imagine being in that situation of waiting for that news. So on to slide 12 with family assistance centers. So these are usually set up pretty quickly as well, but the goal here, it's not so much that process of reunification so it could be gathering information about missing people still, but it's really more likely that these are going to be people who are already family members who already know the fate of their loved ones, that they have been killed or seriously injured. So this is really meant to be kind of just one place that they can come to get all of the information as that is unfolding. And of course, that's probably not all going to be available right at the beginning. So there might be ongoing briefings and things, meetings with whoever needs to be involved in that. And then also starting to get some resources, some financial resources as necessary. And there still could be ongoing information collection if we are still in kind of the missing person stage of things. And I don't know if any of you have seen those forms that are used to collect identifying information, but they are very long and very detailed. And so people are having to kind of provide all of this information while knowing what the potential outcome is going to be if it is still in that searching stage. So here, like at the reunification centers, you are not going to be sitting at a table with a mental health sign on the front waiting for people to come to you. You're going to be circulating. You're going to be looking for people who are getting upset. You're going to be looking for staff members who are going to be upset as well, because they're also kind of getting the brunt of all of that grief and anger, etc. Next, please. So these are set up typically a day to 2 days after there's an MCI. And, as I keep saying across all of these, it's really just going to depend who's going to be there. If it is something that is believed to be a criminal act in origin, Office of Victim Services will likely be there. We'll come back to kind of law enforcement role in a bit. Once again, Red Cross typically going to be involved. So I think the main point here is just there's going to be a whole bunch of people there, and everyone hopefully is there genuinely trying to provide the support for the people going through all of this. But that is not always going to be clear. In all of these settings, people are sort of pivoting from their usual role to now their ICS role. And even though people train and drill for all of that, and that is so important, there still may be questions or gaps or uncertainty about, who's in charge of what kinds of situations. And that can just increase stress for everybody, not having that kind of certainty, that can be unsettling for those dealing with it. All right, next slide, please. So the other thing with these family assistance centers is usually reunification centers. Those are really pretty short term, but family assistance centers can be kept open for extended periods. I'm not going to give like particular time frames, but certainly days, weeks, potentially months. When you have something like a mega disaster like the Los Angeles fires from this winter, they're hopefully going to keep providing those services for as long as people need them. So these can be more established, more ongoing. After a while, they probably settle into a bit more of kind of a routine operation once things kind of settle down and those immediate needs are dealt with. But that is not an easy process for sure. Next slide. So this is just an image of the inside of a family assistance center. So this was in Hawaii, what was that, 2 or 3 years ago at this point. So, typically, I'm sure most of us have seen things like this. It's going to be in a high school gym or maybe in a church or a hotel ballroom or just some big space where you can just have all the tables, hopefully for all of the services that people are going to need. And so as time goes by, probably less strong emotions going on, but then that gets kind of offset with that just exhaustion and fatigue and like, why are we still having to deal with kinds of questions. So the stress levels can still certainly be high, even over extended periods. Okay, next slide. So these are just a couple of other locations, and terminology keeps changing for these things. Availability or organization plans keep changing. So basically, in addition to potentially reunification centers, PICs and FRCs, these are some of the other settings that might get set up very, very rapidly and then kind of evolve typically into the family assistance center once those immediate needs are hopefully addressed for those survivors and families. Okay, next, please. So moving on to hospital emergency departments. Not surprisingly, these are often where people just naturally go. When something happens, like, yes, if something happens at your kid's school, you're going to try to go to your kid's school, right? That's going to be natural. But for something more in the community, often when MCIs happen, people will just automatically go to the hospital because that seems like the natural, logical place. They know injured people are going to be brought there, and so that's where they're going to go. So hospitals absolutely do plan for this, but also those plans can easily become overwhelmed. And one of the things for hospitals is you're going to get multiple people coming in for all of the actually wounded or ill people who are there. So there may be just too many for them to handle. But their plans certainly are going to include social workers, chaplains, in addition to the healthcare response. What is going to be the sort of social human management response? So once again, lots of different organizations might be here, always just depending on the conditions. And next slide. Now, here's where we were going to try to show you an example. Skip, what's our plan for this? Can you show it?
Yeah, Carla, I think we should skip the videos for this.
Will do. Okay, maybe we can still put the links in the chat. We were just going to show a couple of very quick video clips from the series The Pit, which is fictional, but believed to be like really, really well done in terms of showing hospital emergency functioning. And in these particular clips, we were going to show you the hospital's just been notified that they were about to receive a lot of victims from a mass shooting at a music festival. So you can watch these on your own. They're on YouTube, basically, but these are just showing what it's like when the head of the emergency department is notifying the staff and they're being told, like, okay, we've drilled for this, we've planned for this, this is going to be rough. And it just kind of captures what that is like. And I think even though this is, healthcare specific, the same applies across all different response fields. Next slide, please. So last couple of points on hospital emergency departments. Another point here is this is going to depend on the nature of the event. Some MCIs, many of them, I would say, it's clear who's been injured and who hasn't been. But some of them, especially some public health emergencies, think about something like a chemical spill or radiological exposure or some other kind of potential toxic exposure. In those cases, you're likely to have not only the surge of people who have actually been exposed ending up at the hospital, but also the people who are concerned that they have. The group we used to call the worried well, I think that label has kind of fallen out of style as being a bit belittling. Sometimes they're called people with medically unexplained physical symptoms, MUPS. These are the people who are afraid that they've been exposed to something, and therefore they are having real physical symptoms, but those physical symptoms might be the result more of a panic attack or a stress reaction than actual exposure. But you don't know that, right? And so the hospital staff is also going to be dealing with having to triage and figure out who genuinely needs treatment on the medical side versus who the treatment they need really is more the mental health support to de-escalate that anxiety. And here, just like in the reunification center, that anxiety, waiting to find something out, that is going to just create that high level of stress for everybody, including the responders. So generally, DMH through Office of Mental Health typically would not get involved or deployed directly to these hospitals, but it's not out of the question. And it's also entirely possible that people on like county disaster teams might very well be hospital employees. So they might already kind of be embedded in those settings when the event happens. Next slide. So this was another of those clips we were going to show you from the pit. And basically, just briefly, it's showing a reunification of a mother who was shot in the event, but survived, and her teenage daughter coming, and then this young doctor tearing up when she sees that happy reunification. And then she sees the head of the emergency department and apologizes to him and says it won't happen again. And he says, this is going to make me tear up, don't ever apologize for caring for your patients. So we wanted to kind of put that in there just because even when there is a happy ending in terms of people surviving these events, it still is going to be so intense. And, just knowing how that outcome could have varied, we just really want you all to keep in mind that risk and, once again, that need for self-care and for training and for supporting each other when these events do happen. Okay, next slide, please. So those were the main specific settings we wanted to just briefly get into, and once again, encourage you to get much more training on these. But there are just a few groups that we wanted to mention are very likely to be present, not necessarily, especially for media, hopefully not within the actual emergency settings, but they're going to be nearby, they're going to be circling. So media, I could talk for a long time about this, but basically there is absolutely going to be interest by media. Journalists don't mean to say this in a belittling way, love disasters because disasters get views. The audience wants the information. So the audience is creating the demand. The journalists are creating the supply. It's symbiotic. So it's understandable that reporters are going to be on site, but they need to be contained. So this idea of a press collection point, that should always be established. And reporters should be asked to stay there where they will get briefings. But of course, they're out to get the story. And so you can't assume that they are always going to comply with those requests. And then in thinking about the impact of media on survivors, it is very much a double-edged sword. Often journalists will want to speak to survivors, to family members, and it's easy to think that that's always bad, that that's voyeuristic or invasive, and it certainly can be perceived that way by survivors. You've just gotten the worst news of your life, and now someone's shoving a microphone in front of your face asking how you feel. It can be very inappropriate. However, in some cases, it can have some positive effects. It does bring in attention. It validates that this is indeed a significant tragedy, not just for this community, but something that's recognized by the broader state, nation, world, et cetera. It absolutely can mobilize resources. You're not going to get the GoFundMe pages set up if the world doesn't know about what has just happened. And I don't mean to be mercenary about it, but it's just a reality. It also can bring in political attention. I'll come back to that point next. And sometimes if people don't receive that attention, it feels like the world doesn't care. So I was doing some trainings in Buffalo, kind of in building capacity, not response to the top shooting, but after that event, a couple of years later. And I'll never remember, I had two people in two of these trainings in stress resilience and psychological first aid. They were both residents of the neighborhood where the shooting occurred, community members who are now getting trained. One day, one woman in the training said, 5/14 happened and our community needed to grieve, and we couldn't do that in front of the television cameras. She had perceived it as that voyeurism, as being, someone else was getting profit or entertainment even out of seeing the community suffering, and she found it very offensive. Very next day, a different woman said, yeah, tops happened and people were paying attention and we were getting the media attention. And then less than a week later, the horrific shooting at the school in Uvalde, Texas of the children occurred. And she said, and the cameras packed up and moved on and nobody cared about us any longer. So I thought that was such a great example that, it's not all good, it's not all bad, but it is another factor that you need to be aware of. And also you need to be aware that in those of you in an OMH role, or for all of you, unless it is specifically your role to interact with journalists or your assignment, don't. You absolutely should not be speaking to media. You should pass any requests or just notifying that they're on site along to whoever your supervisor, your commander is, and they should be the ones handling that. And part of that is, it's very important in these events that the messaging that's going out is consistent, that journalists are not getting conflicting stories from different people or different organizations, because that is going to spread conflict, get rumors spreading. It's really problematic. And it's also super important, of course, that information not be released to the general public before it has been communicated to the directly impacted public. So that's why at many of these settings, there will be briefings multiple times a day, certainly death notifications done in public before any names are released or any identifying information released to the broader world. But of course now, social media doesn't play by those rules, so I won't get too much into that, but that's just another factor to be aware of. Are people leaking information? Are even, victims, there have been multiple events, school shootings in particular, where the students in lockdown are live streaming what's going on. Oop. Okay.
Kathy was looking for you.
Okay, I think we've got someone unmuted. And so people, that information is getting out way before it should. So I'll stop on that point, but it is just, I think, a complicating factor as well. Okay, next slide, please. So also very likely to be present are elected officials, local authority members, and that here again, double-edged sword. Sometimes that is genuinely because officials, politicians want to show their support for their constituents. That's part of their job. They want to be there. Sometimes the president is called the consoler in chief when the president goes to visit survivors of major disasters. And sometimes that is welcome and sometimes that is not. Once again, validates maybe that is going to lead to some kinds of policy changes, again, brings in resources, but there's the very real risk that both creates a distraction, pulls focus from the actual survivors who may not want that particular politician to be seen as sort of benefiting or interacting with them for political reasons. And then if those policy changes are promised, but they don't occur, that can be this sense of betrayal or just, you were using us for this photo opportunity. So another thing to be prepared for. And some officials involve a lot of security measures. So there again, resources are potentially getting distracted from the actual response to supporting that visit rather than letting people do the immediate work. Next slide, please. And then I mentioned this briefly before, but depending on whether the MCI is the result of a criminal act, certainly you can have varying degrees of law enforcement. You'll usually have local police, state troopers, et cetera, be involved typically, but that could include the FBI, CIA, no, not CIA, I don't think, but anyway, various levels of that. And then also Office of Victim Services. And so some of that is going to be bringing in positive resources. Obviously, if you lose a loved one or you're injured in a crime, you want that crime to be solved. And so ultimately it can be for the better for people, for the good, but it also can really create limitations. The scene itself might be a crime scene that no one is allowed to get to. And then particularly if you do have people who have been killed, in many cases, those remains, if they are able to be identified quickly, they often will be required to be autopsied. And that is not a preference for many people, either for religious reasons or just because they don't want that being done to their loved one's body. But they might not have any choice in that, unfortunately. And then also this processing of remains typically takes quite some time because they need to be thorough. I mean, they're doing their jobs, which is good, but particularly for people from any religions that have customs of burying, cremating very quickly, those often can't be done. And so that's another source of stress and distress and real kind of, spiritual agony in some cases. Okay, next section. So those were some of our typical spaces and things to be considering. I'll just talk for a few minutes and then we should have a couple minutes at the end for any questions. And if people want to start putting questions or comments in the chat, this is a good time to do that. So wanted to talk about some of the longer term support or places that mental health support is often very much needed and welcomed. So in particular, the Buffalo United Resiliency Center, just as an example of this. So broadly described, these are often referred to as community resilience centers. And this is kind of a trend that's opened up in the last few years where these will get set up often in coordination with some kind of existing mental health agency or mental health service organization or things like that. In Buffalo, after the shooting, it was done in collaboration with the Buffalo Urban League, which of course had really deep connections within the community. So the Burke basically provides just a whole lot of different kinds of programming, and some of that is more formal counseling services for sure for the people who are directly impacted. Even if they were not there or lost someone, they still felt directly impacted. But some of it is more kind of wellness and educational and just building community level resilience. So these can be really great. Next slide, please. So this is from the Buffalo United Resiliency Center's website. We'll also give you that link in case you're interested in how these things work. But this is literally like a physical center. It's a community center. And this is where, so again, as far as I know, I don't think there are any plans to wind this down. That event just had its 3rd anniversary and this is going strong. There's a lot of programming and it's great. I've met a number of the people involved with it and, really awesome, focused on just lifting that community up. And I think what's really important about CRCs is some of those other response settings, often by necessity, they are staffed by people from outside of the community because they're people with the specialized expertise and the capacity who need to come in when something major happens. Goal with the CRCs is they really are much more kind of grassroots, community-led, staffed, which I think is very important in the longer run. Next slide, please. Oops. So just briefly, we just have a couple of excerpts from their own website. But, as you can see, it's not aimed only at the direct survivors. As I already said, it was just aimed at kind of everyone who felt that event, which I think is pretty much everyone in that part of Buffalo for sure. Next slide, please. And so just some other examples of what they offer. So some of these are kind of fun activities. They have a lot of youth-based programming as well, workshops, but they also do have, financial resources for victims, and other more specific for those who had that more direct impact, but they sort of don't discriminate based on what people need. Okay, next slide. And then the other kind of longer term source of support we wanted to just mention and encourage for sure is kinds of ongoing support for children, for teenagers, adolescents. So, really wanting to make sure that these can be very developmentally appropriate, because kids' needs who've gone through a traumatic experience are overlap with adults' needs in some ways, but also very distinct. And so you really need to have these kinds, ideally school-based, with people who are specialized in that developmentally suited kind of support, trauma treatment, et cetera. So, very often for young people who go through, whether it's a school shooting, any other kind of disaster, they often feel just so different from their peers. And so groups for kids are often great. Alternative creative approaches, art therapy, sandbox therapy, just kind of knowing what is going to be good for kids. And I think also a lot of what these kinds of programs often include is education for parents, for caregivers as well, because of course it's deeply important that they understand what their child is going through so that they can support them as best as possible. And I think it's always useful to just remind adults working with kids that the most common reaction when kids are traumatized, adolescents too, is regression. They'll lose developmental milestones. They might act younger than they are. And so that can be very frustrating for parents and alarming. So just making sure they understand that and what they can do for that. And then also for any students who had pre-existing mental health issues, learning disabilities, developmental disabilities, et cetera. So always just trying to make sure kids get the support they need, because, we often talk about for adults, you want to get, they had, some of you have probably seen me do this before, they had their baseline functioning, the disaster happens, they either have a decrease in functioning or an increase in anxiety. The goal with traditional disaster mental health is to get them back to their baseline, but kids shouldn't be at a baseline. Kids should be continually developing in all of these realms of functioning. So we definitely want to make sure they are getting the attention they need so they don't fall behind, in some cases kind of irrevocably. Okay, so last very brief section, next slide please, is anniversary reactions. So next slide please, which would be 31 now. So I think anniversaries are really, really important, because I think so often, we always talk about that recovery, that getting back to baseline as being this very gradual, often kind of wobbly process. And that is absolutely true for many people. And I think because it can be so slow, we talking about survivors at this point, often don't even realize how far they may have come in recovering. And so I think for me, anniversaries are really important opportunities to kind of pause and think back. And yes, part of that is thinking back to the awful thing that happened. And that certainly can create another spike in negative emotions, that anniversary reaction. We certainly want to let people know that that is common and probably short-lived. But I also think very often if we don't kind of pause about that, we don't recognize how far we might have come. And we certainly know there's so much emphasis on resilience these days. Sometimes people, why aren't you over this yet? It's been a year. Well, that's not how recovery works. That's not how grief and loss work. So sometimes people judge themselves for not being resilient. We absolutely want to try and get them away from that and help them recognize, okay, but how are you doing relative to how you were and what's been getting you there? Next slide, please. And what maybe could be done to further support that. So I think very common now after mass casualty events, other kinds of community tragedies, there will very frequently be ceremonies, gatherings, reading of the names of the deceased on each year anniversary. And those can be very powerful. For some people, those can be overwhelming. For some people, the last thing they want to do is be in that group setting with those very vivid reminders of what happened. And to me, that is just fine. I think if you are working with someone and an anniversary is coming up, talking through with them what is going to be helpful for them. It is very likely that they will experience that spike in emotions. That doesn't mean they're back down to where they were before. It's probably almost certainly one of those wobbles, and they'll quickly get back to whatever level of recovery they had before. What are positive things that they had been doing to get there? And above all, limit media exposure. Just like mainstream media loves a disaster when it first happens, they also love an anniversary in many cases. It's a hook for another story. And sometimes those stories are wonderful and, really do show, without invalidating what the community went through, show that, Buffalo strong, Boston strong, the fact that they are recovering, they weren't destroyed by this event. But, we never want to overemphasize that or have it feel kind of voyeuristic. So encouraging people, if they don't want to see that, stay off mainstream media, stay off social media, for the few days around the disaster, but find some other way that they're going to mark it privately. And, I think having kind of a personal ceremony is great, but, not feeling pressured to be involved in the public things. Okay, next slide, please. That is it. So we have questions, comments, and I don't know what happened to my screen here, but I am not able to view the chat. So I will count on my colleagues to read me if you do have any questions. Once again, I really encourage you to watch the recording of the first one on helping people and self-care if you haven't seen that one yourselves. And yeah, Mike and Skip, any questions or things you want to add?
Well, just a quick note that we will also be publishing a recording of this presentation. So that'll become available in the next few days. And we'll send that out to folks as well. But thank you, Carla.
Yep.
We're very grateful for all you've done to
And we did
contribute to the
put
success of this.
we did put some of the major links in the chat screen, so anybody who wants to know about Buffalo or the little clips from the pit, and the especially the part one of this MCI program, because that would help you see how this all fits together. So
Great. All right. Well, thank you,
I
Skip
agree.
and Mike.
Thank you, Mike,
Thanks.
for doing that. And,
Yes.
just to mention, we do our live drills at the State Preparedness Center, and we can have like a certain number of people for each drill. So if you haven't attended one, believe it or not, we have one the end of July, and that one involves a shelter situation due to a weather event. And then we have another one at the end of October, which will be a mass casualty event and a family reunification center. So we're really trying to bring these live exercises so folks can understand what goes on. So this was great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you all for attending, making time for this, and thank you for the work you all do out in the field. It is incredibly important, and New York State is lucky to have all of you. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah.
Dr. Vermeulen, thank you very much as well.
Thank you so much.
I see a couple of hoorays for the pit and for Carla. So
That's
I
right.
think to be as far up there as the pit is, Carla, you did an excellent job.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate everyone's patience with our technical glitches. I do not know what happened here, but we'll sort it out for the next one.
That's why we have a backup plan.
Exactly.
Right?
Okay. Well,
We'll stay on for a
Thanks.
couple minutes here just to
Yeah.
see if anybody has questions or if they'd like to offer anything. I'll stop the recording now.
will do.
This is so